Let's talk about time travel. Time travel is one of my favorite genres in anime and movies and video games. And I always wanted to try to use it in one of my D&D and Call of Cthulhu games. The problem is, it always seemed too difficult. My first thoughts are always something like, what if the players meet themselves? What's that gonna mean? Or what if they change something very important in the current timeline, derailing the entire story? What if they travel back in time and change some things that were not supposed to be changed when they experienced them the first time around? Wouldn't that kind of cheapen the whole experience of time travel if the actions don't really matter? It would kind of take the whole point away from time travel. Basically, time travel seems great when the author has absolute control over the story. You can create all these intricate details that loop back and you notice these things that were this way because of the time travel and all that stuff. But when you add players to that equation? For this reason, I don't really try to do time travel in any of my games, but I recently sat down to try to think about how you can make time travel feasible in a D&D game, and I found that not only is it very possible, it's also basically just about finding the right type of time travel to fit your story. So let me show you some of the time travel story types that I think fits within tabletop RPGs and what the individual strengths are in relation to fun and, containing time paradoxes and such. So let's get right into it. And also, I can already feel that wearing a hoodie is going to be the death of me. Trying to anticipate player actions and put up barriers that can sort of contain their behavior is a road that leads to madness. And if we're playing Call of Cthulhu, maybe that's what we want, but maybe not when we are trying to run a game. Basically, this also robs the entire purpose of time travel, so it doesn't really make sense to try that. Instead, we're gonna look at these story types where player behavior sort of doesn't really matter, or it plays into the story. Let's start with a classic, the looping timeline. In this type of story, the players are repeatedly returned to an initial point in time, either from a fixed endpoint or some that varies. Containment-wise, since the player characters aren't really traveling back in time, but more like resetting to a specific point in time, there's no chance of them meeting themselves, so you don't have to deal with that. Also, the whole point of this story is that the player characters want to change something that sort of gives them the right outcome of the time loop that will break the loop and let them progress with their lives. So instead of stressing about the consequences of players' actions, we basically just lean into it. And as a sort of contingency, since resetting the time loop basically erases all the players' actions, you can use that to undo some of their most crazy actions. Maybe they kill a very important NPC or something like that, and you can make sure that the time loop can't be broken as long as that important NPC is not alive. So the looping timeline story is a great way to contain player behavior while they do their time travel stuff. But that's just the boring sort of behind the scenes stuff. Let's look at what makes this story fun. The fun of this story comes from the fact that it is basically this little cage of experimentation where the players can try things they would not otherwise do. Maybe they would find it too risky or too morally abhorrent. But in this looping timeline, they can go a little crazy. Like maybe they want to see what happens if they convince the tavern keeper to stand up for herself against the oppressive tax collectors. Or maybe there's this vengeful coach driver that had this crash coming into town. But what happens if they save this person from that crash? What is he gonna do? Basically just explore the little what-ifs of life without any serious risk to themselves, because if they don't like the result, it's all gonna reset anyway. It's a story where players can explore an event from all kinds of angles and learn things about NPCs that they would not otherwise have been able to do because they can only be in one place at one time normally. But in the looping timeline, they can be everywhere at once, at the same time. It's magic. If the player characters are set into the story involuntarily, it becomes this sort of large puzzle where they need to figure out what exactly they need to do in order to break the loop. Or if they are sent into this kind of story voluntarily, then it is more about figuring out how they achieve a certain outcome, and they can reset over and over again until they reach that point. The only real downside with this kind of story is that it's probably the time travel story that takes the most preparation. You basically need to make a timeline that has all the events that you think is gonna happen. so that when you repeat the loop, the same things are gonna happen again, and there will be no inconsistencies. And also you need to keep the timeline with you when you play the game, so you can add unplanned for events. Maybe the characters go into a basement that you hadn't thought about, and they see someone down there drinking wine. You need to add that event to the timeline, so if they go back to that basement at the same time in the next loop, they're still gonna see that person drinking wine. The looping timeline story is probably best for like a one-shot where you have a few hours to play around in this little repeating time bubble. You can try out various things, see what happens, and have fun with that. But you could also insert it into a larger story as its own little contained story arc. Let's look at the next type of time travel story, the long jump backwards. In this type of story, the player characters are transported far back in time, ideally way beyond their own lifetimes, and they have some kind of mean to get back to the point that they left. Containment-wise, since the player characters are thrown back to events that they didn't participate in, there's no risk of them meeting themselves. Secondly, because they are so far back in time, any changes that they make will be diluted by the vast expanse of time between then and the point that they left. For example, if there's a king that is supposed to be assassinated and they prevent the assassin from killing the king, then maybe later on someone else will try to make an attempt on the king's life and the outcome will be the same. The king will die and these events will just happen. The philosophy is sort of like history isn't made by a few great people. It's made by circumstances, and these circumstances are going to play out anyway, even if you pick out some important characters. Say for example you remove one person, but then someone else is just going to walk in and step into their boots and ride the waves of history anyway. Now the fun of this type of story is that it allows the players to experience a time or event that they have only heard about in stories or legends, like the fall of the Netherese Empire or Strahd's descent into vampirism. It's the fantasy of being a fly on the wall at certain important moments in history, and it's a great way to basically show your players the backstory of your villain or your setting without having to tell them about it. Like when I ran Tomb of Annihilation with one of my groups, I let them experience the fall of Omu in some kind of flashback time skip. So when they subsequently had to explore the ruined city, they had vivid context for the things they found and saw. Now the thing is, if we're traveling so far back in time, we're basically just being tourists. Like, what's the point of going back in time if we can't change anything in the present? Well, there are things that this type of story could do. For example, maybe the player characters are sent back in time where a specific book was really widespread, but in the present timeline it is nowhere to be seen. So it's an easy way to get a copy of this book. Or maybe they need to listen to the final words of a famous businesswoman, or simply just witness a historical event as it truly unfolded, so the historical records can be corrected in their own timeline. This type of story probably works best as inserted into a larger story, because you can then explore parts of the great story in detail. If you do it as like a one-shot, it doesn't really make sense to travel back in time to witness events when the story is so contained. But now let's move on to the next one. Change the past to change the future type of story. In this story, the player characters go back to a point in time that is recent enough that their actions can change the present, and they do so with the explicit intent to do just that. Containment wise, we basically just let go of the rudder and see where things take us. We can have an NPC talk to the player characters about how meeting their past selves is gonna cause horrific consequences, and if they actually do this anyway, we can make up those consequences. For example, if they do meet themselves, their memories of that event will change in real time inside their heads, having this sort of out-of-body, déjà vu-like effect. That's sort of like if you're trying to talk, but you can hear your own voice, so it gives this disorienting, weird feedback loop. And if they decide to go so far as to hurt their former selves, they're gonna receive the same injury immediately on their own bodies. And sort of like as a last resort, you can even have them switch perspectives from their current characters to their past selves, if you think they spend too much time on this aspect of time travel. And in regard with changing the current timeline, well, that is what they're here for, so we're just not gonna worry about it and just lean into it. The fun of the story comes from the possibility of changing the present, sort of twisting fate to the desire of the players to become masters of their own destiny and see the unforeseen consequences of their meddling. If you do this type of story, Try to make sure that the thing that the players need to fix is more complex than something like stopping a wizard from summoning a demon or something similar. It's not really challenging to just go back in time and kill the wizard while they are on the toilet or something like that. Try to make the story about figuring out what they need to change in order to get the desired result. For example, maybe the party witnesses an important NPC being kidnapped by a group of shadowy people. Now they travel back in time, but saving the NPC is not simply going to be about moving the NPC to another location, because the shadowy people are probably just going to show up in that location anyway. So the quest becomes about figuring out how do you actually stop this group from kidnapping the NPC. Learning the identity of this shadowy group could be one option, or figuring out a way to counter the attack when it happens is another option. Setting up this kind of like elaborate Home Alone plan to defend the NPC, or maybe replacing the NPC with a disguised player character could also be kind of fun. Basically, make sure that the players know what's going to happen and what they need to prevent, but they don't know why it's going to happen. So they need to figure out the underlying causes and effects in order to prevent it from happening. And whatever they decide to do, they only have one shot at doing this, because otherwise we would be in the looping timeline story. So this puts more pressure on them. An advantage of this type of time travel is that it creates a really clear story. Basically, the players have it all laid out for them, and they need to figure out how to deal with that. It can also be used to create some motivation for your players by having them experience the dark consequences of failing. For example, maybe they get to witness the rise of the dragons and how they oppress the people, and then they're cast back in time, and they now have to deal with this, knowing what will happen if they fail. It's basically the Mirror of Galadriel, where Frodo is allowed to witness the consequences if he fails his quest. Only in this kind of story, the players get to actually experience that dark timeline, and then they're sent back to their happy time, and they know what's coming. I think this type of story fits all kinds of games. For example, for a one-shot, you can have the players experience this event in the beginning, and then send them back in time, and the whole little one-shot is about correcting that event. Or it can be a larger thing. If you're using it for foreshadowing, it can basically span the entire campaign. They see the end result of failing, and then they spend the entire campaign trying to prevent that from happening. The next type of time travel story is the rewinding time, which is basically Life is Strange. In this type of story, the party gains the ability to rewind time a few minutes or more, either using some kind of artifact, or maybe some boon that has been bestowed upon them. Containment wise, since the player characters are rewinding time, they can't really meet themselves, and also because it's a very short time that they can travel backwards, they can't really mess up the present in any major way. Instead, they can use the ability to experiment with different immediate outcomes of their actions, but once they have settled for one outcome for long enough, it becomes permanent. This means they don't have the time to watch the consequences of their actions play out in the long run, so they have to think on their feet and eventually make a choice. Now, while the ability to rewind time is fun, it's also a huge advantage over the player's opponents, which means that the story needs to be about overcoming overwhelming odds. Basically, the player characters don't stand a chance without this ability, and using it wisely is key for them to succeed. But we should not forget that this ability is also really fun in the small places. You don't need to only use it to change the outcome of dangerous situations. You can also use it to just explore the small what-ifs of everyday life. What would have happened if I'd said this instead of that? What would change if this person got that instead of this? So there's basically this level of great seriousness when using the ability for the power of good, but also this frivolous way to use it for fun things and explore little interactions here and there. Story-wise, I think this kind of time travel works best in very focused, contained stories. For example, a single story arc in a major campaign or a one-shot. Because if this ability, as fun as it is available throughout an entire campaign, it'll probably feel diluted with time, and maybe the players will even forget to use it. You should also put some limitations on this ability so it doesn't slow down the game too much. For example, if the ability comes from a magic item that requires an action to use, it can't really be abused in combat since only one player character can use it per round. Or maybe each attempt to use this ability becomes progressively harder until there's some point where it resets, perhaps at dawn or something like that. You could also put a hard limit on how many charges this item has, but that is likely to make the players more hesitant about using it, kind of spoiling the fun of having this ability in the first place. In short, some kind of soft limit on how to use it is a good idea, and then contain the entire ability within a short story, like a one-shot, where it can't really ruin an overall campaign, and where I think an ability like this can really shine and make that one-shot stand out. The last type of time travel I have for you today is a little bit unhinged and wild. It is the uncontrolled time travel story. In this type of story, the party doesn't decide when and to what point in time they travel to. It just happens to them and they have to adapt to the new situation. Containment-wise, if the player characters were to meet themselves in the past, you can just trigger another time skip and break them apart that way. And since the players don't have any direct control over the way they travel in time, they have less power to intentionally mess up the timeline. The fun part of this story is that it allows the players to change things that they know will happen, but in an unpredictable and disorienting way. They basically stumble upon the opportunities to make a change, and they have to think quickly about how they want to use it. You can also throw the players forward in time so they see the consequences of their actions immediately. For example, maybe they knock out the mayor of a town, and while they're fleeing, they are jumped forward in time to where they are in the woods, in their camp. And they learn that knocking out the mayor caused a lot of chaos in the town, and now bandits run it. While this story can just be a disorienting way to use time travel, you can also make the story about figuring out this chaotic element of the time travel. So the story becomes about learning the patterns of the time skips and gaining some kind of control over it. Basically, if you make some clear rules about how these seemingly random time skips happen, the players have a chance to understand them and then eventually use them to steer themselves out of the situation or towards a desired goal. In order to make time skips confusing but eventually predictable, you can think of 3 triggering conditions that must all be present in order for the time skips to happen. For example, one condition could be that a player character casts a spell. Maybe this is how the whole time skipping adventure begins. A player casts a spell and suddenly the party is thrown back in time and they need to figure out what's happening. The players might notice that the time skips only happen when someone casts a spell, but it doesn't happen every time someone casts a spell, so there must be some other underlying condition. This condition could be the time of the day, the presence of a specific NPC or an item. It could be basically anything you could think of. But if you have 3 layers of conditions, it allows the players to find this pattern eventually, without it seeming too obvious at the get-go. And then when the players have figured out how this works, they can either try to use it to their advantage to steer themselves back to their normal non-time skipping timeline, or maybe towards some kind of goal that they want to achieve, or perhaps just simply use it to avoid these time skips happening. Maybe they are a little bit disruptive to what they're trying to achieve. And those are the 5 different types of time travel stories that I could think of. I realized that I have not really spoken about how you implement time travel or how you make it work in your games. And that's kind of the point. When I started working on this video, as I mentioned earlier, I was of the opinion that time travel is super difficult, it's convoluted, there's all these factors that you can't really take into account, and it was basically this pipe dream of doing time travel sometime in a crazy future where I figure it all out. And then I realized that that is really not the case. Time travel is perfectly fine. It's just a matter of picking the right type of story, right type of time travel, match them together. I guess the point is that you should not be afraid of time travel. I guess the video title could be something like how to stop worrying about time travel in your D&D games or something like that. But I still hope that you found it useful to see what each of these different types of stories can be used for and where the weaknesses and strengths sort of are. Before I go, there are a few things that I want to add about time travel in general. The most important thing to ensure when you're making a time travel story is that the rules are specific and unchanging. Make sure you have answers to questions like what happens to the present if things are changed in the past, and what happens if a person meets their former self. You might decide that changing something in the past doesn't really change anything in the present, because traveling back in time creates a new timeline. So it's basically like makes this track that goes off in a different direction, but the old track remains there. And then maybe you can travel between 2 tracks. Another very important thing is to ensure that the time travel element is central to the story even if it spans like an entire campaign or just a one-shot or a short story arc. If the time travel is just dropped into the story in order to get the players out of a difficult situation or maybe a dead end in the story that the DM has created, it'll just feel cheap, and it's even gonna dilute the players' actions. Like, if you can just go back without much fanfare and change something, what do players' actions really matter? So if you have time travel in your story, make sure that it feels important and impactful while it's there. Make sure that it is the story. Finally, consider whether the player characters travel in time with their body or with their mind. Like, appearing in the past with all your equipment and stuff is going to be very different from simply moving back to a past self with only the knowledge of the future to help you. Mind travel also prevents player characters from meeting themselves in the past, so they can save you some trouble as well. Perhaps the most interesting part of the mind travel is that when you have a character that travels forward in time with their mind, they can have done stuff in between the 2 points where they left and landed. They might find themselves in a new situation, engulfed in the consequences of their past actions, and they sort of had to figure out what has happened and what they're up to now. Anyway, that's all I have on time travel for now. I hope this has inspired you to try out a genre that you, perhaps like me, have avoided so far. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support my channel, the best way you can do that is by giving this video a like and write a comment down below. And subscribe to the channel if you want to catch the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and I'll see you. Bye!